August 1944. The skies over France were filled with the roar of Allied aircraft. The beaches of Normandy had been conquered. The German army was retreating. And deep inside the headquarters of the German command, something unbelievable was happening. The generals who had once terrified Europe were beginning to panic. But not because of American tanks. Not because of American soldiers. Not because of American air power. The thing that shocked them most was something they never expected. Fuel, supplies, movement. The unstoppable machine behind the American army. For years, German officers had mocked the United States military. They believed America had money. They believed America had factories. They believed America had numbers. But they did not believe America understood war. To the German commanders, the American army was a giant with no experience. A powerful nation that could build weapons, but could not fight like a professional military. German officers had spent decades studying warfare. They had created the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that crushed Poland, France, and much of Europe. They believed victory came from elite soldiers, brilliant commanders, and aggressive tactics. They looked at American forces and saw something different. An army built around mass production. An army depending on machines. An army that needed thousands of tons of supplies every single day. German generals believed this was America's weakness. They believed the American army would eventually collapse under its own size. But they were about to discover something terrifying. America's greatest weapon was not only the Sherman tank. It was not only the airplane. It was not only the rifle in the hands of the soldier. America's greatest weapon was logistics. The ability to move an entire war machine across a continent. And at the center of this miracle was one operation that became legendary. The Red Ball Express. A massive highway of trucks. A non-stop supply line. A lifeline that kept General George S. Patton's army moving faster than the Germans could react. This is the story of how ordinary truck drivers became the fuel behind one of history's greatest military advances. This is the story of how the Germans laughed at American logistics, until the Red Ball Express proved them wrong. Before the Red Ball Express became famous, the Allied invasion of Europe was already facing a dangerous problem. On June 6, 1944, thousands of Allied soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy. Operation Overlord had begun. The largest amphibious invasion in history. The mission was simple. Break into France. Defeat Nazi Germany. Push toward Berlin. But winning the beach was only the beginning. A modern army does not move on courage alone. It moves on fuel. Every tank needs gasoline. Every aircraft needs aviation fuel. Every soldier needs food, ammunition, medicine, and equipment. A single armored division could consume hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel in a short period. The battlefield was moving. The supplies had to move faster. At first, the Allies had a massive advantage. They controlled the skies. They had enormous industrial power. They had more soldiers, more vehicles, and more weapons. But there was one problem. The invasion force was trapped on the coast. The supplies were coming from the beaches. The armies were moving inland. The distance between supply dumps and front lines was growing every day. And then something unexpected happened. The American breakthrough. In late July 1944, Allied forces launched Operation Cobra. German defenses finally collapsed. The American army exploded across France. The retreat turned into a chase. And leading the charge was one of America's most aggressive commanders, General George S. Patton. Patton believed in speed. He believed hesitation gave the enemy time to recover. His tanks pushed forward with incredible force. His goal was simple. Do not let the Germans escape. Do not let them rebuild. Keep moving. The German army had faced powerful enemies before. But Patton's speed created a new kind of fear. The problem was not that Patton's army was strong. The problem was that it was moving too fast. And soon the impossible happened. Patton's tanks were outrunning their own supplies. His army was advancing faster than the fuel trucks could follow. The battlefield had changed. Now the question was no longer, can America defeat Germany? The question became, can America supply the victory before the army runs out of fuel? German commanders noticed the problem. They believed they had finally found the weakness. They looked at American forces racing through France and thought, they cannot keep this pace. The German military had always understood the importance of supply lines. In their minds, an army without fuel was already defeated. They remembered their own experience in the Soviet Union. In 1941, Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa. At first, the German army advanced hundreds of miles. The Blitzkrieg appeared unstoppable. But eventually, distance, weather, and supply problems destroyed the momentum. The Germans believed America would face the same fate. A fast army, a long supply line, a collapse waiting to happen. German officers underestimated something they had never seen before. American industrial power transformed into battlefield mobility. America did not fight like Germany. Germany created elite formations. America created systems. Germany focused on precision. America focused on scale. The United States could replace losses. The United States could build thousands of trucks. The United States could create supply networks across oceans. And now, America needed to prove that this industrial power could follow an army moving through enemy territory. The answer came in the form of thousands of truck drivers. Many of them young Americans. Many of them African American soldiers serving in segregated units. They were not famous generals. They were not decorated tank commanders. They were drivers. But their mission was just as important as any battle. They had to keep Patton's army alive. The trucks moved. The operation was massive. Nearly 6,000 vehicles would eventually participate. Drivers worked around the clock. Many drove more than 300 miles per day. Some carried fuel. Others carried ammunition. Others transported food and equipment. The road became a river of American power. A constant flow feeding the battlefield. But the Red Ball Express was not easy. The drivers faced dangers every mile. German aircraft attacked supply routes. Enemy soldiers hid near roads. Mechanical failures were common. The roads were damaged. The trucks were overloaded. Drivers often had little sleep. A single breakdown could create a traffic jam that delayed thousands of vehicles. Yet they kept going. Because they understood something important. Every truck they drove meant soldiers could keep fighting. Every gallon of fuel they delivered meant another tank could move. Every box of ammunition meant another battle could be won. The war was being fought at the front lines. But victory was being delivered on the roads behind them. Meanwhile, General Patton's army continued advancing. His Third Army was moving faster than almost anyone expected. German soldiers who had fought in France began experiencing something terrifying. They were not being chased by an army that was slowing down. They were being chased by an army that somehow kept coming. The Germans had expected the Americans to stop. They expected supply problems. They expected exhaustion. Instead, they saw American tanks still moving. They saw aircraft still attacking. They saw fresh ammunition arriving. They saw fuel appearing when it should have been impossible. The German generals started asking a question. How are they doing this? The answer was the Red Ball Express. A hidden army of truck drivers. A machine behind the machine. The Germans had laughed at American logistics. Now they were beginning to fear it. Because they realized something. America was not winning only because it had more soldiers. America was winning because it could keep those soldiers fighting. And in modern warfare, that could be the difference between defeat and victory. German generals laughed at U.S. logistics, until the Red Ball Express fueled Patton's blitz. The French countryside. A road stretching endlessly into the distance. Hundreds of military trucks moving through dust, smoke, and darkness. Their headlights cutting through the night. Their engines roaring without rest. To the soldiers on the front lines, these trucks were not just vehicles. They were survival. They were the difference between advancing and stopping. Between victory and defeat. The Red Ball Express had become the heartbeat of the American army in Europe. But behind this incredible operation was a reality that few people knew. The men driving those trucks were fighting their own war. A war against exhaustion. A war against impossible deadlines. A war against the constant pressure of keeping an entire army moving. Because General George S. Patton was not slowing down. And every mile he advanced created a bigger challenge. The farther the American army pushed into France, the farther the supply trucks had to travel. The battlefield was moving faster than anyone had planned. Patton wanted speed. The Germans needed time. And between them was a race. A race powered by gasoline. In August 1944, Patton's Third Army was cutting through France like a blade. German forces were retreating after the devastating defeat in Normandy. The once feared German army that had conquered Europe was now struggling to escape. But Patton was determined not to let them recover. He believed in constant pressure. Keep attacking. Keep moving. Never give the enemy a chance to breathe. His commanders admired his aggressive style. His soldiers respected his confidence. But behind every successful attack was a question nobody could ignore. How long could this continue? A tank without fuel becomes useless. A soldier without ammunition cannot fight. An army without supplies cannot win. The Germans understood this. And many believed they had found America's breaking point. German generals studied the situation carefully. They saw American forces advancing hundreds of miles. They saw supply lines stretching dangerously far. They believed history was repeating itself. Just like Germany had failed because of logistics in the Soviet Union, America would eventually fail because it was moving too fast. But they misunderstood one important thing. America was not relying on traditional military supply methods. America was creating something completely different. A moving industrial system. A factory on wheels. Long before the soldiers reached France, another battle had already begun. Thousands of miles away, American factories were working non-stop. Factories produced tanks, aircraft, weapons, vehicles, spare parts, fuel containers, everything needed to support a global war. The United States had transformed its economy into a massive war machine. But producing supplies was only half the battle. Getting them to the battlefield was the real challenge. The Atlantic Ocean had to be crossed. Ports had to be captured. Roads had to be repaired. Warehouses had to be organized. Then trucks had to deliver everything directly to soldiers fighting on the front lines. The Red Ball Express was the final link in this enormous chain. It was the moment when American industry met the battlefield. The drivers of the Red Ball Express faced brutal conditions. Many routes were dangerous. The roads were crowded. The trucks carried heavy loads. The drivers often operated with little sleep. Some drove for 12 to 16 hours a day. There were moments when drivers had to push themselves beyond normal limits. A truck breaking down could delay an entire convoy. A wrong turn could waste hours. A missed delivery could affect an entire operation. The pressure was enormous, but the drivers kept moving. Many of these men were African American soldiers. During World War II, the U.S. military was still segregated. Many black soldiers were denied combat roles. Instead, they were assigned support missions. But the Red Ball Express showed the world that support roles were not secondary. These drivers were carrying the weight of the entire army. They were moving the fuel that powered Patton's tanks. They were delivering the ammunition that allowed soldiers to fight. They were helping defeat Nazi Germany. Their contribution became one of the most important examples of how every role mattered in a modern war. A soldier on the front line might never see the person who delivered his supplies. A tank commander might never meet the driver who brought the fuel that allowed his tank to move. But every victory had thousands of unseen people behind it. The Red Ball Express drivers were those unseen heroes. Inside German headquarters, the mood was changing. At the beginning of the Allied advance, German officers believed American momentum would collapse. They expected supply shortages. They expected delays. They expected Patton's army to stop. But days passed, then weeks, and the American army kept moving. The Germans were confused. Their intelligence reports showed that the Americans should have been struggling. But the attacks continued. More tanks appeared. More aircraft arrived. More ammunition reached the battlefield. The impossible was happening. The Americans were maintaining an offensive hundreds of miles from their original landing point. German commanders had underestimated the scale of American logistics. They had expected a temporary advantage. Instead, they discovered a permanent one. America could replace losses faster than Germany could create them. America could move supplies faster than Germany could destroy them. America could fight a war of distance. And Germany was running out of answers. By September 1944, Patton's forces were approaching the German border. The speed was incredible. But the cost was also becoming clear. The Red Ball Express was under extreme pressure. The operation was never designed to last forever. It was created as an emergency solution. But emergency solutions became essential. At its peak, the Red Ball Express moved thousands of tons of supplies every day. It became one of the largest truck operations in military history. The trucks traveled through France like a non-stop highway. Some vehicles were painted with special markings. Some routes were controlled exclusively for supply traffic. Military police managed movement. Maintenance crews worked constantly. Everything was organized around one goal: keep Patton moving. Because Patton's army was not just advancing, it was chasing. And every hour mattered. The Germans had built their reputation on speed. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. They had used fast-moving tanks and coordinated attacks to overwhelm their enemies. But now they were facing something new. The Americans had created their own version of Blitzkrieg. Not only based on tanks, not only based on tactics, but based on supply. A German tank might destroy an enemy vehicle. A German aircraft might attack a convoy. But America had thousands more vehicles waiting behind the battlefield. The Germans were fighting an army, But behind that army was an entire continent of production. This was the moment the German generals finally understood. They had not underestimated American soldiers. They had underestimated America itself. They thought numbers alone could not win wars. They were right. Numbers alone cannot win wars. But numbers combined with organization, technology, and logistics can create something almost impossible to stop. The Red Ball Express was proof. It showed that modern warfare was not only decided by generals making plans on maps. It was decided by engineers, mechanics, factory workers, truck drivers, and ordinary people performing extraordinary tasks. The Red Ball Express would operate for only a few months, but its impact would last forever. It became a symbol of American military power, not because it destroyed enemy armies directly, but because it made victory possible. The trucks carried fuel. The fuel carried the tanks. The tanks carried the battle forward. And behind every American advance in Europe was a supply line that refused to stop. The Germans laughed at American logistics. They believed it was a weakness. Instead, it became one of the greatest strengths the world had ever seen. And the road that carried Patton's army forward became legendary. The road known as the Red Ball Express. German generals laughed at U.S. logistics until the Red Ball Express fueled Patton's blitz. September 1944. The Allied armies were no longer fighting for a beachhead. They were fighting for the heart of Europe. The invasion that began on the beaches of Normandy had transformed into a massive offensive. German forces were retreating. Cities were falling. The Allied advance seemed unstoppable. But hidden behind every battlefield victory was a silent struggle. A struggle that almost nobody saw. The struggle to keep the army supplied. Because war is not only about who has the strongest weapons. It is about who can keep those weapons alive. A tank can be the most powerful machine on the battlefield. But without fuel, it is nothing more than tons of metal sitting in a field. An artillery gun can destroy enemy positions. But without ammunition, it becomes useless. A soldier can have courage. But without food, medicine, and equipment, courage alone cannot win. The Red Ball Express understood this reality better than anyone. Every truck was carrying more than supplies. It was carrying momentum. And momentum was everything. Because General George S. Patton's army was moving at a speed that shocked both allies and enemies. Patton was famous for one belief. A moving army is a winning army. He believed pressure was the key to defeating Germany. Give the enemy no time, no opportunity, no chance to rebuild. His Third Army became one of the fastest moving forces of the entire war. But speed created a dangerous problem. Patton's tanks were moving faster than the original supply plans could support. The American army had advanced so quickly that traditional logistics could not keep up. The front line was changing every day. Roads that were safe yesterday became important supply routes today. Supply depots that were built for one position became useless after another advance. The entire operation was a race against distance. And distance was becoming the enemy. The Germans had always believed distance would defeat the Americans. They thought Europe was too far away. They thought America could not maintain a massive army across the Atlantic. But they had misunderstood something fundamental. The United States did not just send soldiers. It sent an entire system. Across the Atlantic Ocean, American ships continued arriving. Thousands of tons of equipment crossed the ocean. Vehicles, weapons, fuel, food, medical supplies. The scale was enormous. But once those supplies reached France, another challenge began. They had to move fast. The Red Ball Express became the bridge between American production and American victory. The operation was built around one simple idea. Create a highway that belonged only to supplies. No civilian traffic. No unnecessary stops. No delays. Military police controlled the routes. Convoys moved continuously. Drivers followed strict schedules. The system was imperfect, but it worked. And in war, a working system can change history. For the men behind the wheels, the mission was exhausting. Many drivers spent long nights alone on unfamiliar roads. The darkness brought danger. German aircraft could appear without warning. Enemy patrols could attack. Mechanical failures could leave a truck stranded. And there was always the pressure of time. The drivers knew someone was waiting. A soldier at the front. A tank crew preparing for battle. An artillery unit ready to fire. Thousands of lives depended on their delivery. They were not pulling triggers. They were not charging enemy positions. But their mission was just as critical. They were keeping the army alive. One of the biggest lessons of the Red Ball Express was that modern war had changed. In previous centuries, armies often depended on nearby resources. They lived off the land. They moved with limited supplies. But World War II was different. It was an industrial war. A war of machines. A war where entire nations became factories. The battlefield stretched across continents. And the side that could move resources faster had a massive advantage. Germany had brilliant commanders. Germany had experienced soldiers. Germany had powerful weapons. But Germany could not match the industrial and logistical power of the United States. The difference became impossible to ignore. Inside German command rooms, officers watched the situation with increasing concern. They saw American forces pushing deeper into Europe. They saw Patton's army continuing its attacks. They expected the Americans to stop, but they did not. The question became, where were the Americans getting everything from? How could they continue? How could they keep moving after advancing so far? The answer was traveling on French roads every night. Thousands of trucks. Thousands of drivers. Thousands of tons of supplies. The Red Ball Express had become the invisible force behind the American offensive. But success came with problems. The Red Ball Express was operating under extreme pressure. The trucks were heavily used. Maintenance became a constant battle. Tires wore out. Engines broke. Roads became damaged. The system was consuming resources almost as quickly as it delivered them. The operation was not a perfect machine. It was a desperate solution created by necessity. But sometimes history is changed by imperfect solutions. The Red Ball Express did not need to be perfect. It only needed to keep moving. And it did. By keeping Patton supplied, the Red Ball Express helped fuel one of the fastest advances in American military history. The Third Army pushed toward the east. German defenses weakened. The Allies moved closer to Germany itself. Every mile forward was supported by the trucks behind them. Every victory had a supply story. Every battlefield achievement had a logistics story. The world watched generals. The world watched tanks. The world watched aircraft. But behind them was another army. An army of drivers and mechanics. An army moving silently through the night. The Red Ball Express proved something that changed military thinking forever. Wars are not won only by the people who fight at the front. They are won by everyone who makes the fight possible. The factory worker building the truck. The mechanic repairing the engine. The driver delivering the fuel. The soldier using the ammunition. All connected by one enormous chain. Break one link, and the entire system fails. But the Red Ball Express kept that chain strong. And because of that, Patton kept moving. The Allies kept advancing. And Germany faced a new reality. The war they believed would be decided by tactics was now being decided by logistics. The German generals had once laughed. They believed American supply lines were too large, too complicated, too vulnerable. But the roads of France told a different story. The trucks kept coming. The fuel kept flowing. The army kept advancing. The Red Ball Express was not just a transportation operation. It was a weapon. A weapon made of engines, gasoline, and determination. And it helped prove one of the most important lessons of World War II. An army can only move as far as its supplies allow. And America had built a supply machine powerful enough to carry an army across Europe. The summer of 1944 had changed the course of history. Only months earlier, Nazi Germany still controlled much of Europe. The German army had spent years building a reputation as one of the most powerful military forces the world had ever seen. They had defeated Poland in weeks. They had crushed France. They had pushed deep into the Soviet Union. The world had learned to fear the speed of the German war machine. The Blitzkrieg. The lightning attack. A combination of tanks, aircraft, and infantry moving together with deadly precision. For years, Germany believed speed belonged to them. But now, in the fields and roads of France, something different was happening. America had created a new kind of speed. Not the speed of one attack, but the speed of an entire nation. The speed of production. The speed of transportation. The speed of supply. The Germans had created a weapon based on movement. America created a weapon based on endurance. And the Red Ball Express became the engine behind that endurance. The roads of France became a battlefield of their own. Every day, thousands of trucks moved through villages, forests, and highways. Some roads were damaged from fighting. Some bridges had been destroyed. Some routes were under threat from German attacks. But the convoys continued. The drivers knew something important. The war was not waiting for perfect conditions. Neither could they. A soldier fighting at the front did not care about the difficulties behind him. He only knew one thing. When he needed ammunition, it had to arrive. When his tank needed fuel, it had to be there. When his unit needed supplies, someone had to deliver them. That someone was often a Red Ball Express driver. Many of these drivers never received the same recognition as the soldiers fighting on the front line. They did not appear in famous battle photographs. Their names were rarely mentioned in military reports. But their contribution was impossible to ignore. Without them, the tanks would stop. Without them, the offensive would slow. Without them, Patton's famous advance could not continue. They were fighting a different kind of battle. A battle measured not in captured territory, but in miles driven. General Patton understood the importance of supply better than many commanders. He was known for aggressive attacks and bold decisions. But he also understood one simple military truth. A commander can only attack with what he can supply. Patton's strategy depended on speed. Speed depended on fuel. Fuel depended on trucks. And trucks depended on the men behind the wheel. The entire offensive was connected. A single delay could affect thousands of soldiers. This was the fragile balance of modern warfare. One of the most impressive parts of the Red Ball Express was its ability to operate almost constantly. Day and night. The trucks moved. The engines never seemed to stop. Drivers followed routes through unfamiliar territory. Many traveled through darkness to avoid enemy observation. The sound of engines became a familiar noise across France. To civilians, it was a sign that liberation was coming. To German soldiers, it was a warning. The Americans were not running out. They were increasing. The German army was facing a problem they had not expected. Every military force has limits. Soldiers get tired. Vehicles break down. Ammunition runs low. But the Americans seemed to have discovered a way around those limits. When German forces destroyed one group of vehicles, more appeared. When American units suffered losses, replacements arrived. When fuel became a problem, the trucks delivered more. The Germans were fighting an enemy that could absorb damage and continue. That was the terrifying reality. Germany had experience. Germany had tactical skill. But America had something equally powerful. A system. Behind the battlefield was the full power of American industry. Factories in the United States were producing equipment at a scale the world had never seen. Workers who never stepped onto a battlefield were still part of the war effort. Every vehicle produced, every piece of equipment built, every shipment sent overseas, eventually reached soldiers in Europe. The Red Ball Express was the final connection between those factories and the battlefield. It was where American industry became military power. But even the greatest systems faced challenges. By late 1944, the operation was under enormous strain. The roads were becoming longer. The army was advancing deeper into Europe. The distance between supply points and front lines kept increasing. The Red Ball Express had solved one problem, keeping Patton moving. But now a new question appeared. How long could it continue? The operation was never designed to become permanent. It was created as an emergency response, a temporary solution. But temporary solutions sometimes become legendary. Behind the moving convoys were thousands of mechanics. Their job was simple. Keep the trucks alive. Every vehicle was valuable. A broken truck was not just a machine problem. It was a military problem. A damaged engine meant fewer supplies. A destroyed vehicle meant slower movement. Maintenance crews worked constantly. They repaired vehicles, changed tires, fixed engines, returned trucks to the roads. They were another hidden force behind the Allied advance. The Red Ball Express showed the world a new reality of warfare. The battlefield was no longer only the place where bullets were fired. The battlefield included factories, ports, roads, railways, supply depots, and every person who kept the system running. The Germans had focused heavily on the battlefield itself. America understood that the battlefield started thousands of miles away. The war was won before soldiers reached the front. It was won in production lines. It was won in transportation networks. It was won by people who understood that victory required more than bravery. It required organization. As Allied forces pushed closer to Germany, the meaning of the Red Ball Express became clear. It had not simply delivered supplies. It had delivered momentum. It had kept an army moving when many believed movement was impossible. The Germans had expected American strength to collapse under its own size. Instead, that size became America's greatest advantage. The same thing the Germans mocked became the thing they feared. The endless flow of supplies. The endless movement of vehicles. The endless ability of America to continue. The Red Ball Express had transformed logistics into a weapon. And history was about to remember one important lesson. A great army is not only built with soldiers. It is built with everything that allows those soldiers to keep fighting. Late 1944. The war in Europe had entered a new phase. The Allies had broken out of Normandy. France was being liberated. The German army was retreating toward its own borders. But victory was still not guaranteed. The closer the Allies moved toward Germany, the harder the fight became. The enemy was no longer fighting to conquer. They were fighting to survive. And desperate enemies are dangerous. German forces began creating stronger defensive positions. They prepared new lines. They used every advantage they had left. For the Americans, the challenge was no longer simply advancing. The challenge was maintaining the ability to advance. And that meant one thing: supplies. The Red Ball Express continued to push forward. But the conditions became more difficult. The weather changed. The roads became worse. Rain turned dirt paths into mud. Cold temperatures slowed vehicles. The trucks that once moved quickly now faced new obstacles. But the mission remained the same: deliver, return, repeat, thousands of times. The operation depended on discipline, because a supply system only works when every person performs their role. A driver had to follow the route. A mechanic had to repair the vehicle. A commander had to organize the movement. A supply officer had to calculate what was needed. One mistake could affect an entire army. The Red Ball Express was not glamorous. There were no famous charges. No dramatic battlefield victories. No enemy surrender ceremonies. But every day these men performed a mission that was just as important. They fought against distance. And distance was one of the most powerful enemies in war. The European battlefield was enormous. America was thousands of miles away. Every weapon, every vehicle, every piece of equipment had traveled across an ocean before reaching the front. The Germans were fighting close to home. The Americans were fighting an ocean away. Yet America was able to maintain a massive army overseas. That was something Germany never fully understood. German commanders continued searching for ways to slow the Allies. They knew they could not match American production. They knew they could not win a long industrial war. Their only hope was to create delays, slow the advance, force the Americans to stop. Because they believed if the Americans stopped, their supply system would collapse. But the Red Ball Express proved the opposite. The supply system itself was what kept the advance alive. The Americans had created a cycle. Factories produced, ships transported, trucks delivered, soldiers advanced. The cycle continued, and Germany could not break it. General Patton's Third Army became a symbol of American aggression. His soldiers moved through France with confidence. They had defeated experienced German formations. They had crossed difficult terrain. They had survived intense fighting. But every soldier knew the truth. A fast army is only powerful when it can be supported. Patton could order an advance. But someone had to make that advance possible. Behind every tank column was a supply convoy. Behind every attack was a logistics plan. Behind every victory was a hidden operation. The Red Ball Express. The drivers themselves faced a difficult reality. They were constantly under pressure. Many had little rest. The schedule was relentless. A driver might complete one dangerous journey and immediately prepare for another. There was no celebration. No long break. The road always called. Because somewhere ahead, soldiers were waiting. The men behind the wheels understood that their work mattered. They were not just carrying boxes. They were carrying the ability to fight. The story of the Red Ball Express also became an important chapter in the history of African American military service. During World War II, the American military was segregated. Many black soldiers served in support roles rather than combat units. But the Red Ball Express demonstrated the importance of those roles. The drivers proved their skill, courage, and dedication under extreme conditions. They operated one of the most important transportation systems of the war. Their work challenged the idea that only frontline combat determined military value. The battlefield needed everyone. And these drivers helped carry America toward victory. By the end of the operation, the Red Ball Express had achieved something remarkable. It moved an incredible amount of supplies across France. It supported one of the fastest military advances in modern history. It helped keep German forces under pressure. And it showed the world that logistics could decide the outcome of a war. The Germans had spent years perfecting the art of attack. But America had perfected the art of sustaining attack. That difference became enormous. The lesson was clear. A nation does not win a global war only by having powerful weapons. It wins by making sure those weapons can continue operating. It wins by moving resources. It wins by adapting. It wins by creating systems that the enemy cannot match. The Red Ball Express was proof that the American military machine was not just large. It was organized. It was flexible. It was capable of turning industrial strength into battlefield power. The German generals once looked at American logistics and laughed. They saw a weakness. They saw an army that depended on too many supplies. They believed that dependence would become America's downfall. But they misunderstood the greatest strength of the United States. America did not see logistics as a burden. America saw logistics as a weapon. And the Red Ball Express became that weapon. A weapon without cannons. A weapon without bombs. A weapon powered by engines, fuel, and determination. The trucks eventually disappeared from the roads of France. The emergency operation came to an end. But the impact remained. The Red Ball Express changed how the world looked at warfare. It proved that the person delivering the fuel could be just as important as the person firing the gun. It proved that victory could depend on roads as much as battlefields. And it proved something the German commanders learned too late. You can defeat an army. You can destroy tanks. You can capture territory. But defeating a nation's ability to keep fighting is a much harder battle. The Red Ball Express kept America moving. And that movement helped change the course of history. The story of the Red Ball Express was never just a story about trucks. It was never just a story about roads. It was the story of a hidden force that changed the outcome of the largest war the world had ever seen. In the summer of 1944, German generals believed they understood the American military. They looked at the United States and saw an inexperienced army. They saw soldiers who lacked the battlefield history of Germany. They saw a force that depended on machines, fuel, and supplies. And they believed those things would become America's weakness. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated the power of a nation that could turn its entire economy into a weapon. They underestimated the ability of America to organize, produce, and deliver. They underestimated the people behind the front lines. The war in Europe was not decided only in the trenches. It was not decided only by generals sitting in headquarters. It was decided by millions of people working together. Factory workers built the equipment. Sailors transported it across the ocean. Mechanics kept machines running. Drivers delivered supplies. Soldiers used those supplies to fight. Every person was part of one massive chain. And the Red Ball Express was one of the strongest links in that chain. When Patton's tanks moved through France, they were not moving alone. Behind them came a never-ending stream of support. Fuel, ammunition, food, equipment. The trucks followed the army like a shadow. They traveled through dangerous roads. They operated under pressure. They continued even when conditions were difficult. Because stopping was not an option. The front line depended on them. For the German army, the reality became impossible to ignore. The Americans were not slowing down. The supply problems they expected never came. The collapse they predicted never happened. Instead, the American war machine continued pushing forward. The Germans had built one of the most feared military forces in history. But they had never faced an enemy with this level of industrial power. Germany could create powerful weapons. Germany could produce skilled commanders. Germany could win individual battles. But America could replace losses. America could produce more. America could keep moving. And that ability changed everything. The Red Ball Express also left behind another important lesson. History often remembers the generals. It remembers the battles. It remembers the famous moments. But behind every major victory are thousands of people whose names are forgotten. People who worked in silence. People who carried the responsibility without receiving the spotlight. The drivers of the Red Ball Express were those people. They were not leading armies. They were not making headlines. But they were carrying the future of the Allied campaign on their shoulders. Every mile they drove mattered. Every delivery mattered. Every truck that reached its destination helped bring the war closer to an end. By the time the Allies reached Germany, the message was clear. Modern warfare had changed forever. The strongest army was not only the army with the best weapons. It was the army that could keep those weapons operating. The army that could move faster. The army that could recover quicker. The army that could continue when the enemy expected it to stop. The Red Ball Express represented that new reality. It transformed logistics from something happening behind the battle into a weapon that influenced the battle itself. The German generals laughed at American logistics. They believed a huge supply system was a weakness. But history proved something different. The very thing they mocked became one of America's greatest advantages. The trucks, the drivers, the fuel, the organization, the endless movement. Together they created a force Germany could not defeat. The Red Ball Express eventually disappeared into history. The trucks stopped running. The roads became quiet. The war eventually came to an end. But the lesson remained. Victory is not created by one person. It is created by millions of people working toward one goal. A soldier on the battlefield may fire the weapon, but someone had to build it. Someone had to transport it. Someone had to supply it. Someone had to make sure that soldier could keep fighting. The Red Ball Express was a reminder that sometimes the heroes of history are not the ones standing in front of the cameras. Sometimes they are the ones driving through the darkness, keeping the world moving forward. And that is why the story of the Red Ball Express remains one of the most remarkable examples of logistics changing the course of war. The Germans thought they had found America's weakness. Instead, they discovered America's greatest strength. Not just power, not just production, but the ability to keep going. This was the story of how German generals laughed at U.S. logistics, until the Red Ball Express fueled Patton's Blitz. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to subscribe for more cinematic World War II documentaries, untold stories, and forgotten moments that changed the world. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next story, because history is full of battles. But the stories behind those battles are what truly reveal how the world changed.